Welcome. So this is our first lesson on Dreamweaver, and what I want to do is just have you jump into a project. I think a great way to learn an application is just start using it. And so we'll do a little project, a little about me or an intro page, and as we go, you'll kind of get a feel for the layout and some of the tools that you'll be using in Dreamweaver. This version is CC 2017, and if I'm correct, it's 2017.5. So if you have some other version, it may not be exact. I do recommend, if you have Creative Cloud, that you download that version to 2017.5. At the time of this recording, it's the latest version. However, as time goes by, they might put something else out. Okay, so what we're going to start out with is defining a site. And there's some of these things you have not yet seen if you've only watched the Chapter 1 videos. And so you're going to get a little bit of a preview of some of the tools that you're going to learn in more depth later on. But we're going to start by defining a site. When I first opened Dreamweaver, I'm getting this page. If this is the very first time you've opened Dreamweaver, you might get a welcome page that's got a link to videos, and it's got start a new site or something to that effect in the middle. One way or another, if you can get to the standard workplace layout for the standard workplace layout, right? It should look something like this, and then the first tab here in your panels is the Files panel, and that features a button called Manage Sites. So I'm going to click that button, and basically what we're going to do is we're going to set a site route. This is an extremely important concept in Dreamweaver. Dreamweaver tries to automate all the tasks that we learned in HTML and CSS in those classes. And in order to do that, it centralizes everything around the concept of a site. So it's extremely important that the first thing you do is you define a site. Unfortunately, Dreamweaver lets you start working without defining a site. So that can get you into trouble. Alright, so within the Manage Sites windows, we're just going to hit this button right here that says New Site. And the most important things we need to do at this point in time are to give the site a name. So we're just going to call this, Site 1. Something very unimaginative. And then with this folder icon, we're going to navigate to a location where you can save it. Now, I've got a folder created called Dreamweaver 2017. You don't need to have that. You might link to your files that you downloaded from lynda.com or just a new folder anywhere. I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call it Site 1, and we'll say Select Folder. Okay. And so if you look at that path, it's going to Site 1. And save. Okay, now we have a site called Site 1. If we say Done, up here we have a site called Site 1. And now we're ready to get started. If you have this window, you'll notice that you have a button here called Create New. If you're not looking at this window, you can also go up to File and say New. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a new HTML document. So it should default to HTML. You can add a title here, or you can add the title later, doesn't really matter, but we'll do, an About Me page and hit Create. Okay, so in this view, what we've got going is this is a split view. Notice up here, split, and the top window is live. This is your live view. This is your visual view, and then down here at the bottom part of the window, we have got code. Right? Now there's a few things you may or may not have. Here's the Properties menu down here. I don't remember leaving it there. But if you don't have it there and you want it there, you would get that under Window, under Properties, and it'll give you this floating bar, and usually the first time you use it, it's floating around the page, and then you can dock it at the bottom of the page by just dragging it down here. And then if you don't want it to take up that much real estate on the page, you can right-click on it and minimize it. For this particular lesson, we may not need it at all, but if we do, it's right there. Okay, what else are we looking at here? On this right side, you've got a place for panels, and the 4 panels that are available to you by default are Files, which we already used to define our site, and then CC Libraries. I don't have any Creative Cloud libraries set up for this lesson, so we won't be using that. This panel is particularly useful. It's the Insert panel. It should default to HTML. but in case yours is something other than HTML, click HTML. And basically, this just puts a lot of useful tools at your fingertips. You could get these in other ways. You could use a property inspector. You could code it, but it's nice to have these buttons nearby. And then this panel is your CSS designer. This is where you create your style sheets, and so we'll be using this as well. Okay, so the primary tool we're going to be using at this point is the insert menu, but I do also want to point out down here you've got the DOM, the object model, the document object model, right? And so since we created a new document, it started writing code for us, and like every HTML document, it starts and ends with an HTML tag, and then it goes to a head tag. It's got a closing head tag, and then a body tag and a closing body tag. And so those basic HTML structural elements are part of the document object model, and you can see them reflected in this portion, in this panel right here. Why is that important? Do we have to care about that? Well, you could ignore that, but it's a really useful tool, so you should probably get used to it. Basically, what's happening is as you're creating visually, it's writing code for you. And as you're creating visually and/or writing code, it's outlining the code using the document object model. And so you have this visual outline, a running outline of your document, and you can control things right from that outline. Could you live without it? Sure. You can just look at the code and get the same information. But this is streamlined, stripped out all the details, and so it's really kind of easier to focus on. Okay, in this big blank space up here, let's start by structuring a page, right? So we know that when we click on this, we're in the body section, which is perfect. That's where our content should be. So let's start adding things to our body section. Now, you might remember a pretty common methodology in the past is to create a wrapper or a container so that you don't have to guess at the window size that your user's using. So I'm going to start with a div. I'm just going to go up here in the insert panel. I'm going to grab this div tag and just drop it over here. Alright, so you can see it created this little box, and that box is labeled as with a div, and it throws some dummy text in there. Content for the new div tag goes here. And if you look down here in the code, here is the code that represents that. And if you look over here in the document object model, or the DOM, you can see that the div is showing as a nested element under body. So 3 different ways we've got that going. Alright, now what we can do right off the bat is we can pop over here to the CSS designer, and we can create a style sheet. So we want to pop up here and hit the plus sign to add a CSS source. And since this is going to be a one-page site, we're going to create we're going to define the CSS in page. So essentially we're choosing to use an internal style sheet rather than an external style sheet. If you ever have a website with more than one page, it always makes sense to use an external style sheet. But since we know this one's one sheet, we're going to define it in page. Okay? And so you'll notice it now created this style section down here, and it also put the style tag in the DOM. Alright, now that we have our source figured out, let's add a selector. And so a selector is something that you're going to control using styles, something you're going to format using styles. And so we know we have a style called body. This is actually a CSS element, so we don't have to use an ID with a pound sign or a class with a dot or a pseudo class or anything like that. It's an existing CSS element or an HTML element, so we can just type in body, and then once we have that selector, then we can go down here and we can add a property. And it's already waiting for us to type in a property here. So I'm going to put in the property background color, and as soon as I start typing, it gives me suggestions, and I can click on the one that I want. And let's use slate blue. And then what I like to do is within the slate blue color, let's see, let's let this rest a second, and then we're going to come back and we're going to edit that color a little bit. Okay, so now body, if you remember, fills the entire window, right? But we've got this div tag right here. This is a box inside the window, and so let's create a selector for the div tag. Now notice it likes to suggest body div, and that's a little too generic for me because I might want to use multiple divs within the body, right? So I'm going to get rid of that, and I'm going to create an ID. I'm going to call it wrapper. Alright, so now notice that the wrapper shows up in the style sheet, and the wrapper, yeah, just right here. So with it, for the wrapper, I can add some properties, and one thing I want to do is set the width. And I could specify a specific number of pixels wide. In this case, just to be flexible, I'm going to do 80%. And so my div, my wrapper, should be 80% of the total body. Now, you'll notice that nothing happened. And the reason nothing happened is even though I created the wrapper in the style, I haven't applied it to anything yet. And so you could apply it in the code, but you can also apply it here in the live view. If I click on my div, I get this little handle, this little label, and if I click on this little plus sign next to it, this is a place where I can add a class or ID. And if I just start typing the ID name, it auto-completes, or it gives me suggestions. And so in this case, wrapper is what I want. So I click on that, and now my my div should end up being 80% of my window. Okay, so I'm going to keep working on it. I'm going to do a little bit more to it. I'm going to center it on the page, and if you remember that's in CSS, you want to do margin auto. You notice how this was working? I'm putting my property over here and my value over there. So I said margin auto, and now it's centered within the body, right? And then let's also give it a background color. If all goes well, I should never see the background color, but I might be able to work with it while we're going, right? So I just gave it a white color just to make it stand out off of the background. Alright, so there is my wrapper. Now, let's put some structure inside the wrapper. Let's create a header. So I'm going to go back inside my insert tools right here, and I'm going to grab, I'm going to go down here. These are my like structure, my CSS elements for structure, and I'm going to grab this header, and I'm going to put it inside the div. Okay. And if you look at the DOM model, you can see that the header is now nested inside the div. Okay. And then I'm going to go back and I'm going to do it again with navigation. I'm going to put it inside the div. Okay. Now that didn't work for me here. It didn't put it in the right spot. So I can pick it up and I can put it back by just getting it right in the right spot, and there it is. Right. Okay, and then I'm going to do a main. This will be where the main content goes. I'm going to try to get that inside the div. See if I can do it. I'm trying to get it just right. And yeah, I did it. Okay, and then we'll do a footer as well. Get this footer, and we'll put it right after main. Yep, got it. Okay, so if you look at the DOM, you can see inside the div, I've got these 4 sections lined up: header, nav, main, and footer. Okay, perfect. Okay, so they're all just in placeholder mode right now, and so now we can start playing with the CSS to bring the page to life, giving it the structure that we're looking for. So let's go back to CSS, and let's see what happens if we hit body. So now that we've given it a minute to chew on it, it's representing this background color by showing us a swatch of color. And I'm actually going to darken this up a little bit. So if I click on this, here's my color slider, and I can choose from all of these different hues, these different gradations of this color. But I can also use this slider for lighter and darker, or this one for transparency, right? And so I'm going to darken this up about 3/4 of the way, something like that. Okay, so I'm getting a nice dark background. And then let's do something for the header tag. And so we'll add a selector, and we'll call this one header. Again, it's a CSS element or a HTML5 element, so I don't need an ID or a class. I just name it. And then within this header, I'm going to give this some properties. I'm going to give it some height. Let's make this maybe 82. I'm thinking of using 72 point type, which is a standard size, and then 5 pixels of padding on the top and bottom, so a total of 82 pixels. Okay, and then let's give it a color, background color, and we'll use that slate blue again. Okay, so we get that nice color, right? Let's see, as long as we're here, let's go ahead and throw in some padding. So if you remember the idea of padding, it's giving just a little bit of space inside the border until you hit the content. And so that just makes like the text not be right up against the line. Instead, the text is indented 5 pixels from the top, 5 pixels from the left, right and bottom. Okay. All right, next, let's take a look at this navigation. So we can add, once again, a CSS element or a HTML5 element called nav. And within this nav, we can get a little bit tricky here. We can give it a width of, let's say, 120 pixels. Oops, look what I did. I'm always doing stuff like that. I've got to spell it right. Width. And then we'll do 120 pixels. And then we'll do a float. And we'll float it left. So what that does is it allows the rest of the content to wrap up along the side. Okay, and then we'll give it padding of 5 pixels. And then we will give it a height. Let's go 500 pixels. Okay, and we're not seeing that happen yet, and I'll show you why in just a minute. And let's give it a background color. So we'll give it a background color, and I'm making this a monotone style of a page. So I'm going to go with slate blue again, but then to differentiate it from the header, we're going to give it a tint of that color. So I'm going to let it breathe for a second, and then come back, and you can see the swatch. Now if I come to the swatch, we're actually going to lighten up off of that blue a little bit. And so our nav takes on kind of a lavender sort of a color. Alright, so there's a kind of a placeholder for our nav. Now for our main, we want to do something similar. We have to pay attention to what we did to the nav. Because with the nav, we set the height to 500 pixels, and then we added padding to the top and the bottom. So if we want the main section to come out even, we've got to make sure we use similar sizing. So we're going to add a selector, and this is main, and again, HTML5 element. I don't need a class or an ID. And then we're going to give it a height of 500 pixels. And we're going to give it padding of 5 pixels. And if we did that correctly, we should be coming out just about right. Now, one thing you'll notice is that the even though we gave it a padding of 5 pixels, it doesn't look like it did anything. And one interesting thing when you use a float like this is you actually have to consider the entire width of the nav plus the padding that you want. So that nav was 120 pixels, plus it had 5 pixels of padding of its own on each side. So this total width is 130. So if we wanted this to be 5 pixels, we'd actually need to be 135. So even though we already have padding, actually if we click off of it and click back on it, then we're going to get this visual representation. Let me scooch this down a little bit. Then we're going to get this visual representation of the padding. And if you unlock this so that each side can be unequal, then we'll go in here on the left side and we'll make that 135. Okay. Now it appeared to do next to nothing, but if you'll notice that C came off the edge just the slightest amount, and that's all we were after. Okay. All right. We need a footer. Oh, wait, we need some color. So let's add a property for our main. And this is going to be, again, background color. And we're going to use our slate blue. This time, again, we'll click off of it, then back onto it. And when we do that, we get the color swatch. This time, we're going to take that intensity of that blue way down. So it's more of a slightly tinted white, really, is what we're looking for. And if it's not tinted enough for you, you can cheat it a little bit. We just want enough contrast that it doesn't look identical to the navigation. So there we go. Good, good. Okay, and then now we're ready to go on to our footer. So for the footer, once again, add a selector. We're going to put in a footer, HTML5 element, and we're going to add maybe a height. And this can be, what do you think, maybe 50 pixels? And we'll put in a background color. Slate blue. In this case, I kind of like that the footer matches the header, so I'm going to just leave it slate blue. And then we can do some padding. 5 pixels. And maybe we'll center the text here. We'll do a text align center. Okay. Good. All right, now we're still showing our div tag down here, and we don't actually want the div tag. We just wanted the div tag to contain the other page layout elements, and the only reason we're still seeing it is because there's some dummy text that was placed inside it. So if we just highlight this dummy text and delete it, well, if we try, Dreamweaver doesn't want me to delete that for some reason. Whoa! Undo, undo. Danger, Will Robinson. Okay, what's going on with that? It's trying to delete the entire div instead of just the text. So I'm going to go down here into the code. I'm just going to back it out of there. Okay, so now the div is still there, but the content is not. And we got exactly what we want. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and save this. I haven't saved it yet at all, and we're going to call it index.html because, as always, that is the default page, the name of our default page on the server, right? I did HTML. I like .html, but it really doesn't matter if you use .html or .html, and it should automatically save into our site folder where we defined our site. Okay. All right, let's just take a minute and look at this code. Let's go, maybe we can go to just code, just so you can get an idea of, as we've been clicking around, what's been going on. So as we've been working in the CSS designer and creating these CSS selectors and that one ID and putting all the properties onto it, it's created under the style section. It has created our style sheet. So here we have a nicely indented style sheet with our properties and their values. And so before Dreamweaver, we would have to have typed all of that in, right? And then once we finish the style section and the head section, down here in the body section, we've got our div ID wrapper. We've got a header, a nav, a main, and a footer. Okay, pretty straightforward. And then over here in our DOM, we've just got an outline view of the exact same thing. So this is the nice thing about Dreamweaver is that, you know, previously in HTML and CSS class, we had to do everything by code. Now we can do things live in the live view, and it writes the code for us. And that could be good or bad. Sometimes it does things we don't understand, and then we have to dig into the code to figure it out. But if you're a visual person and you're trying to do things, you're trying to design things visually, then it's nice to see it visually instead of doing code and then looking at a browser and then doing code and looking at a browser. You can do it all together. I do like to use split view so that I can see the visual and the code together. All right, let's go ahead and populate some content here then. We did already, when we were creating this document, put in a title called About Me. So we've got that much content already. Now let's go up here in our header, and how about we put in your name? So, or not. not so friendly with me with the text. I think I just haven't yet gotten comfortable with the clicking requirements here. But in this box, I'm just going to put in some text. And then while I've got that in there, this text should be right. It came in as a paragraph in the header section, right? It automatically, I didn't specify I wanted a paragraph, but it went ahead and put it into a paragraph for me. And so we can edit that up a bit. If we click on it, you'll see that it's in a paragraph, and then we've got these HTML attributes right here. So I can click on that. Instead of a paragraph, I can make it maybe an H1, something like that. Okay. I actually want it even larger than that, so I'll call it an H1, and then what we'll do is we'll edit it with our CSS designer. So within my header, I'm going to add a selector, and it's offering me wrapper header H1. I was just going to say header H1, but it threw it inside the wrapper. Probably overkill. It wouldn't hurt me to leave that just like it is, but I'm just going to call it header H1. And then within that, I can just add some properties. For instance, we can put in font family, maybe Arial, comma, sans serif. Okay, we can put in font size, and I think I mentioned earlier I'm going to go for 72. We can do font weight, bold. We'll do text align. We'll do centered. We'll do bold, Arial. That's about all I want to do to it. You know what? I should specify here 72 pixels. There we go. That's more like I was thinking is going to happen. Okay. The one thing that's happening that I don't love is that it's this H1 has some padding in it by default, and so if I want to override that, I'm going to say padding top 0, and that didn't do anything. All right. That's interesting. All right. I'm just thinking about how best to handle this. Okay, I'm going to use some code just because I think cutting and pasting it here is going to do it the best. So I'm going to take these styles in this header section. What's happening is this H1 concept is throwing things out of whack for me. And so I'm just going to put these selectors in the header section rather than in the H1. And then I'm going to get rid of this H1 style altogether. And then down here, I'm going to get rid of this H1. So this is going to be just some header text. I'm not specifying H1. And there's what we're looking for. Okay. All right. And I cheated, right? But essentially what happened was that H1 was adding padding and some sizing issues that I didn't care for, and instead of going through the trouble of figuring out what it was causing it and then getting rid of what was causing it, I simply got rid of the H1. I got rid of the problem instead of fixing the problem, for better or worse. Let's see what happens if I get rid of this padding top. It looks fine. Looks fine. Okay. All right, so for your About Me page, obviously put your own name, and if it doesn't fit at that size, make it smaller or bigger or whatever. All right, let's go over here to the navigation. Now, we said this was going to be a single page, so it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have a navigation, but we can link to some external sites. We can do like a favorite site. Maybe some placeholders. etc., etc. All right, so if we take a look at what it did to the code just now with the navigation, once again it put in P's for paragraphs, and you know that's not the best, but it's not horrible either. So we'll live with it for now. One thing that's pretty common with navigations is for people to put in a list. So they're doing LIs. I'm just copying and pasting this P a couple of times just to add in some more placeholders. All right. Okay, so you'll notice that these P's are all inside the nav, and so I can edit all of them to an extent with the nav tool. And so if I go to nav and I go to properties, I'm going to shrink down my DOM a little bit so I can see the properties of this nav. Okay, then I can do some stuff like, let's add in a property for display block. That'll allow them to fill the width of their container rather than to stick to the width of the text. And maybe we'll do, let's do font, family, Arial, font, weight, bold, and yeah, I think that's fine for the nav. And then what we'll do is we'll put in some links, right? And so for one of these, like this one that says favorite site, we'll go up here and we'll actually make it a link, right? So for the link, we'll put in http://www.something. How about homestarrunner.com? Right. So now that P became a link. Okay. Now, now that it's a link, it takes on the characteristics of a link, meaning that it's blue and it's underlined, and I want to affect that style, right? And I could do it under nav, but I want to use my pseudo classes. So with nav clicked, I'm going to hit the plus sign on the selector, and it's gonna offer me something completely unrelated, so that's fun. So I'm going to do nav space a colon link, and so I'm creating a hyperlink pseudo class specific to the navigation. And that's always a good idea, because if you just created a link without the nav in front of it, it would affect every link in the site. And what we want to do instead is we want to affect just the links in the nav. Okay, so